So welcome back again. We are going to discuss about the efficiency of market and trying to understand two important ideas in economics, namely the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. That's the objective of this particular module. When you go to a vegetable market, I'm just giving you the example from Chennai because we are sitting in Chennai and recording this video. So suppose you go to a vegetable market, you are delighted to find the extremely red tomatoes, but at the same time you will be stunned by the high price most often. So what happens in this market is there are two set of agents operating in the market, right? We have already seen them in the previous chapter. The sellers and the buyers. So the sellers who are bringing these tomatoes to the market, they are bringing with the hope that they get a price which is way above the cost of production. But from the buyer's point of view, the buyers will be always happy because they would always prefer to get these tomatoes at a lower price. Right? No consumer will be happy to pay a higher price. So from a society's point of view, the big question what we want to ask is that, is there a right price for these tomatoes? We will see the answer to this question towards the end of this particular module. So, as I mentioned, in our previous discussion, we saw how the demand and supply forces determine the prices and quantities in the market. So, we saw that how the prices are determined in a competitive market, and then we described the allocation which is happening in this competitive market without asking the fundamental question that, is this outcome desirable from the society's point of view? Or at the equilibrium, we saw that the quantity which is produced and also consumed, is it too large? Is it too small? Or it's just right? That's what we are not so sure about it. There are different branches of economics. One branch of economics is the welfare economics. So what does this welfare economics actually deals with? Welfare economics is a very important branch of economics. In fact, many of the Nobel laureates belong to this particular branch, especially from India. We had Professor Amartya Sen, who got the Nobel Prize for his seminal contributions on welfare economics. But here we are going to deal with some fundamentals of welfare economics. So welfare economics is nothing but a study of how the allocation of the resources are affecting the economic well-being. So we are going to look at the economic well-being and how do we actually measure the economic well-being. So our objective is very simple. Right? What is the benefit to the buyers and sellers by transacting in the market? That's a simple question we want to answer in this particular module. And then, from a society's point of view, what is how the society can make these benefits as large as possible. So, when we discussed about the 10 principles initially, we had a great deal of discussion about the virtues of market, where we sort of argued that markets are one of the best ways of organizing economic activity. So in this particular module, we actually want to push this argument a little further and then try to use the tools of welfare economics to sort of show you that in fact this principle actually holds. All that you need to do is basically you have to just wait till the end of this particular module to question which we asked in the first slide, that whether the price of the tomatoes in the market, is that just right? Okay, that's the simple question. Okay, I'm just talking about tomatoes as an example. Okay, it can be for any good or any service which is transacted in the market. Just for your understanding, right, we are just taking the example of tomatoes. Please keep that in mind. Let's look at how the buyers are actually benefiting from the market participation. So in order to understand the benefits to the buyers, let's understand the idea of consumer surplus. And then we move on to the benefits to the producers, which we call it as the producer surplus. So, in order to understand this idea of consumer surplus, let me just give you a very simple scenario here. Some of you can easily relate to this scenario. The scenario is something like this. Suppose you got a rare cricket bat which is signed by MS Dhoni. Okay, 2011 IPL final. Some of you may remember the CSK versus RCB. So you somehow got this bat with you. It's a memorabilia. And you probably may not be a big fan of cricket. I'm sure most of you will be a fan of cricket, but let's assume that you don't follow cricket. So what you probably can do, you probably want to sell this off. And the best way to do so is basically by using the technique of auction. You want to auction this bat. It's a kind of a rare bat because it is signed by MS Dhoni. And let's suppose that 4 people actually turned up for the auction. Let's call these 4 people as Sachin, Rohit, Virat and Harbhajan. Okay, I mean these are just random names. Okay, now, each of these 4 fans who are really big fans of cricket, they probably want to buy this bat. And each of them have some willingness to pay, right? Each buyer has some maximum where they are willing to pay for this bat. So, for example, Sachin willingness to pay is, let's say, 1 lakh rupees. That's the maximum he is willing to pay. So, anything more than that, Sachin probably is not keen, right? He probably will leave the auction. From Rohit's perspective, Rohit can pay only a maximum of 80,000 rupees. Virat has only 70,000 as his maximum willingness to pay. And Harbhajan willingness to pay is even lower, only 50,000 rupees. So, willingness to pay is nothing but the maximum a consumer or a buyer is willing to pay for a good or a service. So, this is an increasing bid auction, right? Whoever is bidding the highest price will obviously get the bat. Okay, it's an increasing bid option. So, the bidding starts at 10,000. So, the minimum value of this is 10,000. So, obviously once the bidding starts, right, the price increases because Harbhajan's willingness is 50, Virat's willingness is 70,000, Rohit's willingness is 80,000 and Sachin's willingness is 1 lakh. So, the price actually increases. And then the final result of this bidding process is, even though it starts at 10,000, obviously it is Sachin who is going to win the auction because by 80,000, right, the price hits 80,000, then the Rohit will drop out. Right? That's the maximum he is willing to pay. So, any amount higher than 80,000, right, Sachin is happy to get the bat and then he gets the bat because he is the highest bidder. This is the result of the auction. Now, what we want to do is basically we want to sort of use this willingness to pay to figure out what is this idea of consumer surplus. So, the way we can define consumer surplus is that's nothing but the willingness to pay minus the actual price paid by the buyer. So, for example, assume that there was just only one bat which was available in the auction, right? There was just one bat. And Sachin's willingness to pay is 1 lakh. The actual price he probably paid is 80,000 or slightly more than that. Okay, in order to win the auction, he should be the highest bidder. Okay, so any price above 80, Sachin will win the auction because the others will just leave the auction. So, Sachin has a surplus, which we call it as the consumer surplus. And what is that consumer surplus? Sachin's willingness to pay is 1 lakh. That's the maximum he is willing to pay. right? That's 1 lakh, and the amount that he paid is, just assume that it's 80,000. So what's the difference? Is 20,000. So that's what is called as the consumer surplus, the benefit to the consumer from participating in the market. You will have several examples if you think from your day-to-day life. You will find several examples like this, right? So on the other hand, the other 3 bidders in this auction did not get any surplus because they did not buy, because the price was too high. So they just quit the auction, midway between or halfway between. So they just left. Now let's extend this example for 2 bats. Initially we just had 1 bat and then 4 people were bidding. Now let's suppose that there are 2 bats available for sale. Okay, and let's assume that the price per bat is 70,000 rupees. Now who's going to buy with this price? Remember, Sachin is obviously going to buy this because the maximum he is willing to pay is 1 lakh. The price is 70,000. So Sachin's consumer surplus is 30,000 rupees. At the same time, with 70,000 rupees for the bat, now Rohit is also interested to buy because his maximum that he is willing to pay is 80,000 and the price of the bat is 70,000. So Rohit also get a benefit of, or the consumer surplus of 10,000 rupees. So if I add up Sachin and Rohit's surplus, I get the total consumer surplus, which is nothing but the 30,000 plus 10,000. I get 40,000 rupees as the rupee value or the benefit to the consumer in participating in the market. And this is what we call it as the consumer surplus. So let's use this consumer surplus to derive the demand schedule and the demand curve which we saw in our previous discussion. So the demand curve actually did not come from heaven. It did not just fall from heaven. The way we actually derived our smooth demand curve, the story behind is just what we described right now. So on the left hand side of the slide, you will see the demand schedule where you have the prices and you have the quantities. On the right side, you have the demand curve, which I will just discuss. How did you get this? So what we saw was any price above 1 lakh, there are no buyers. So obviously the quantity demanded is 0. So any price between 80,000 and 1 lakh, only one buyer will be there. Only Sachin is interested to buy the bat. So if the price is between 70,000 and 80,000, now Sachin will obviously buy the bat. Rohit will also come to the market to buy the bat. So the quantity demanded will be 2. And any price which is between 50 and 70,000, now you will have 3 consumers or 3 buyers for the bat. Okay. So Sachin, Rohit and Virat. So the quantity demanded is 3. So any price less than 50, what happens? All consumers are now interested to buy because the price is way below what is that they have maximum they are willing to pay. This is what is our demand schedule, which you are already familiar with. Now let's draw a demand curve using this information. Okay, so let me just mark this here. These numbers here, the prices, right? So we have 80,000, 70,000 and 50,000. So what we are actually seeing is that any price above this 1 lakh, nobody is interested to buy the bat. That's the maximum Sachin is willing to pay, the person who has the highest willingness. So anything above that, he will not buy. He will be interested only if the price is at least 1 lakh and below that. At 1 lakh, he may be indifferent from buying. Okay, so any price below, Sachin gets some benefit in the form of consumer surplus, so Sachin will be happy to buy the bat. So here we are assuming that each person is buying a single bat. Okay, at a price of 1 lakh and above, the quantity is 0, quantity demanded is 0. So between 80,000 and 1 lakh, if the price is suppose between 80,000 and 1 lakh, right, obviously the quantity demanded or only the Sachin will buy that. That's something to note. Only one individual is interested. Now let's suppose that the price is between 70,000 and 80,000. So obviously the Sachin will buy because his maximum he is willing to pay is 1 lakh. But at the same time, now Rohit is also interested. So anything between 70 and 80, Rohit also will be happy to buy the bat because Rohit's maximum he is willing to pay is 80,000. So now the quantity demanded is 2. Okay. So if the price is between 50 and 70,000, obviously Sachin will buy, Rohit will buy, and also you will have another consumer, which we call it as the marginal consumer, who might exit if the price increases above 70. Virat will obviously leave the market itself. With the prices between 50 and 70,000, the quantity demanded is going to be 3, and any price below 50,000, the quantity demanded will be 4 units. So what we have just derived is nothing but our demand curve, which looks like a step function. Okay, demand curve which is looking like steps. But our assumption in the market is basically, in a competitive market, is there are many buyers and sellers. So obviously you will see that if you want to draw a demand curve with many buyers in the market, the gap between these steps will become smaller and smaller, and eventually you probably will get a smooth downward sloping demand curve. So now, using this information, let's go ahead and figure out what is the consumer surplus using the demand curve. Let's suppose that the price is 80,000 rupees. So obviously at a price of 80,000, we know that the quantity demanded is just 1 unit because his maximum is 1 lakh. So the consumer surplus is the difference between the price and the maximum the buyer is willing to buy. So that's going to be 20,000, right? So this shaded region here, this shaded region denotes the consumer surplus. CS denotes the consumer surplus. So now let's assume that the price is 70,000. What happens to our consumer surplus? So with 70,000, Sachin's consumer surplus is 1 lakh minus 70,000, that's 30,000, right? This is for Sachin. And then we also have one more buyer in the market, that's Rohit. So Rohit will be happy to buy because his willingness to pay is 80, and he can buy the bat at 70,000. So his consumer surplus is 80 minus 70, that's 10,000. For Sachin, he has a consumer surplus of 30,000. Rohit has a consumer surplus of 10,000. Okay, so the consumer surplus or the total consumer surplus in this case is 40,000. So what is interesting here to note is, what is this consumer surplus? Diagrammatically, the consumer surplus is nothing but the area which is lying below the demand curve and above the price. So our price in this case is 70, okay, and this region of the demand curve, which is lying above the price line, is the total consumer surplus. Okay, so that's the key thing to remember. So the area above the price line and below the demand curve denotes the consumer surplus in the market. Let's bring it and or make it more generalizable by drawing a smooth demand curve. So we have a standard downward sloping demand curve, and let's assume that the price is P1, and at that price the quantity is Q1, and the consumer surplus, we have just defined it as the area which is above the price line and below the demand curve. So this triangular region, this triangle ABC denotes the consumer surplus for a price of P1. Okay, so it is just the area of the triangle. You know that from the high school, like what is the area of the triangle is half base times height. So it is exactly that geometrically consumer surplus. So what we are actually interested in knowing is what happens to the consumer surplus when the prices go down from P1 to P2. So P2 is less than P1, and then at a price of P1, the initial consumer surplus is given by this triangle ABC. Now, suppose the price falls in the market from P1 to P2. What happens in the market? So obviously, there are some benefits to the consumers who are buying initially, right? So initially the quantity was Q1, right? All the consumers along this region initially were buying this good. So therefore, they had an initial consumer surplus which is given by this triangle ABC. Now, for all those consumers, because the price fell from P1 to P2, their consumer surplus increases because now they are paying a lower price given by P2. So the consumer surplus increases for those consumers by this region of the rectangle B, C, D and D. That's the extra consumer surplus to the already existing buyers in the market. At the same time, when the prices fall, obviously there are also consumers who would prefer to buy now because the prices have fallen. They did not buy earlier because the prices are higher. So some new consumers will enter the market, and therefore their consumer surplus is now given by this triangular region CEF. Okay, so what happens as a result of the fall in price is the consumer surplus has gone up. So a fall in price is beneficial to the consumers, and this has great policy implications. If you go and study more and more economics courses, this is not just a textbook construct. It has important implications in the policy making, especially when it comes to something like the mergers, right? If two companies decides to merge, obviously the possibility of prices going up is going to be much higher. So therefore, the policymakers will have to then decide about whether they should allow the merger, because the consumer surplus is going to be lost because the prices are going to go up. So it's not just a textbook construct. It has great policy implications. So here we are just worried about, how do we measure the consumer surplus using a diagram, and then what we are actually showing is, diagrammatically, is that a fall in the price actually increases the consumer surplus. So consumer surplus exactly measures the benefit the buyers receive from participating in the market. So it is nothing but what is the willingness or what is the maximum they are willing to pay minus the actual price they pay. It's an extremely good measure, as I just mentioned, from a policymaker's point of view. It's an extremely good measure of economic well-being from the policymakers who want to satisfy the buyer's preferences. And this holds only when you assume that the buyers are rational and the buyers are the judge of their own benefit. Okay, so our assumption, as we learned from our 10 principles of economics, is we assume that the agents are basically rational. Okay, so it works. It doesn't work when the buyers are irrational. So the key takeaway from our discussion is basically remember that consumer surplus is nothing but the area below the demand curve and above the market price. And a lower price increases the consumer surplus for both the existing buyers as well as the new buyers entering into the market.